Rich man forces black waitress to play piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. Drop a comment below if you've ever faced a similar situation where you turn the tables and prove someone wrong with your talent. We'd love to hear your stories. It was just another typical evening at the Grand Oaks, a high-end restaurant tucked away in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The soft hum of conversations mixed with the clink of fine china as the evening crowd filled the room. In the far corner, a grand piano stood like a silent witness to countless stories unfolding in this elegant space. To most of the patrons, the atmosphere felt like a celebration of affluence, a place where people came to indulge and show off their success among the waitstaff. However, there was one young woman who carried a quiet passion that not many knew about. Her name was Emily Williams, a 27-year-old waitress with a calm demeanor, but eyes that held a fire within them. She had been working at the Grand Oaks for over a year now, balancing her shifts between serving dishes and carefully maintaining a composed smile for the guests. But inside, Emily was struggling with a deep conflict. She had always dreamed of being a concert pianist, of stepping onto grand stages, playing for an audience that appreciated her artistry. Unfortunately, reality wasn't as kind as her dreams. The bills had to be paid and her family needed support. So she set aside her piano ambitions for now, choosing to work in a restaurant that, though not glamorous, had one thing that kept her going: a grand piano. It sat in the corner of the dining room collecting dust while patrons ate their meals. But for Emily, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder of the music that ran through her veins. Every day after the rush of orders, when the restaurant grew quieter, she would sneak away for just a few minutes to play the piano in the back. Those moments were the only ones where she felt truly herself, where her hands could finally speak the music that had been locked inside for years. But most of the time, she had to keep that side of her hidden. No one at the restaurant knew just how serious she was about pursuing music. Only a handful of the staff had caught her playing during her breaks, and they too understood that it was more than just a hobby for her, it was her life's calling. Emily often wondered what it would be like to follow her passion, to step into the world of classical music, to show the world that she was more than just a waitress. But those were just daydreams, distant thoughts. She pushed aside as she continued with the routine of serving meals and making ends meet. Yet deep down, she always believed that one day, if the opportunity ever came, she would find a way to turn her dreams into reality. It was on a warm Friday evening when everything changed. The Grand Oaks was filled with the usual bustle of the elite dining crowd, the sound of clinking wine glasses and muffled laughter bouncing off the walls. Emily was no different from any other night, her movements graceful as she delivered plates of food, with a smile that hid the exhaustion she felt. The air was thick with the scent of gourmet dishes, but to her it all felt like a blur. She moved between tables, refilling wine glasses and taking orders, her mind partially on the rhythm of the tasks and partially on the piano in the corner of the room, which seemed to beckon her, even though she didn't have the luxury to play it. That's when he walked in. Sebastian Monroe, a millionaire entrepreneur, notorious for his arrogance and sharp wit. He was impossible to ignore, a man who commanded attention as soon as he entered any room. His perfectly tailored suit and cold, calculating maze made him look like someone who believed the world was his to control. Sebastian had an air about him that made others uncomfortable, a sort of superiority that seemed to radiate from him and demand submission from everyone around him. As he made his way to the table with his entourage, Emily noticed how he seemed to scan the room, observing everything, sizing up the people around him. His gaze landed on her for a moment, and she felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just a casual look. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was being judged, like she was somehow less than. She brushed it off and continued with her duties, trying not to acknowledge the unease building in her chest. However, Sebastian wasn't the type to leave people alone. He had a way of making others the center of his attention, especially those he found intriguing or in his mind easy to manipulate. As the night wore on, he began his little game. Every time Emily passed by his table, he made a comment, something snide or cutting designed to make her feel small. At first it was subtle, a remark about how she must be tired from working all night, then a comment about how she looked like someone who had big dreams but was stuck in this job. Emily, doing her best to maintain her composure, nodded politely and moved on, but the jabs kept coming. Finally, Sebastian leaned back in his chair and asked, "So, Emily, what do you do when you're not waiting tables? Surely someone with your look must have more going on, right?" Emily, taken aback, hesitated. She had heard it all before, the condescending tone, the assumptions about who she was based on her job. She tried to brush it off, but he wouldn't let it go. "I play piano sometimes," she said quietly, hoping the conversation would end there. Sebastian's eyes lit up. A pianist? Well, why don't you show us your talent then? His voice was loud, almost challenging, and suddenly the attention of the entire room shifted to her. She could feel the eyes of every diner on her, the weight of their expectations and judgment pressing down on her. The pressure was unbearable. She froze for a moment, wanting to refuse to hide away from the spotlight he was so keen to put her in. But then the words came out of his mouth with a smirk. Come on, there's a piano right over there. Don't tell me you're all talk and no talent. His laughter was like a slap in the face, and Emily felt her heart race. She had spent so many years hiding her passion, never daring to show it to anyone. But now in front of all these people, Sebastian had called her out. It felt humiliating, but at the same time there was something deep inside her that didn't want to back down. This wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about proving to herself that she wasn't just a waitress, that her talent was real and worthy of respect. With a deep breath, she walked towards the piano. The room fell silent, all eyes on her as she sat down at the keys. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. But as she began to play, something shifted inside her. She was no longer a waitress, no longer the woman he had tried to belittle. She was an artist, and the music she played was hers to share with the world. As the night progressed, the atmosphere at the Grand Oaks became thick with tension. Emily's usual calm composure was now cracked under the weight of Sebastian Monroe's taunts. She had been a waitress at the restaurant for over a year, but she had never been the subject of such ridicule. At first, she had tried to brush it off, reminding herself that people like Sebastian with their wealth and arrogance were a dime a dozen. She had encountered similar customers before, people who believed their money made them superior, who thought they could belittle those who served them. But something about Sebastian was different. His sharp remarks, though veiled in humor, cut deep. He didn't just comment on her looks or her job. He had latched onto the one thing that mattered most to her. Her music. Emily had spent years building walls around her dreams, pushing her passion for the piano into the background as she focused on surviving. After all, music was a luxury, something that came second to paying bills, helping her family, and dealing with the grind of everyday life. Most of the staff at the Grand Oaks knew that Emily had an incredible talent for playing the piano. She would often sneak in a few moments between shifts to play on the grand piano in the corner, letting the music fill her soul when the pressures of the world felt too much. But no one knew how serious she was about her craft. No one knew that her piano playing wasn't just a hobby, it was her identity. Music was the one thing that truly made her feel alive, the one thing that reminded her of who she truly was. But tonight, Sebastian had shattered that sense of control. With his mocking tone and challenge, he had exposed her deepest insecurity. The eyes of the entire restaurant were now on her. She could feel them even before she turned toward the piano. It was as though the room had held its breath, waiting for her to either rise to the occasion or crumble under the pressure. As she stood up from her serving station and made her way toward the piano, her heart pounded in her chest. She felt as though every step was a battle, each one taking her closer to the moment of truth. The grand piano gleamed under the soft chandelier lights, and for a brief second, Emily hesitated. It was as though the weight of the entire room rested on her shoulders. But then something inside her clicked. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just someone who cleaned tables and served food. She was an artist, a musician. And tonight she was going to prove that to everyone, especially to Sebastian. She sat down at the piano, her fingers brushing the cool ivory keys. For a brief moment, the nerves nearly took over, but she quickly pushed them aside. She had played this song countless times before. It was familiar, soothing. Emily began to play, each note flowing from her fingers like an extension of her soul. She had chosen a piece she knew by heart, a soulful melody that spoke of sacrifice, hope, and resilience. The music seemed to fill the air, weaving its way through the room, drawing everyone's attention. The once laughing diners became quiet, and even Sebastian, who had leaned back in his chair with that smug grin, fell silent. As Emily played, she felt a sense of liberation. The music wasn't just a response to Sebastian's taunts. It was a declaration. It was her statement to the world, to herself, that she would no longer hide her passion, no longer allow someone like him to diminish her worth. The notes came faster now, more confidently. Emily's hands moved with a grace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself an artist, a woman with dreams too big to be stifled. As she neared the end of the piece, Emily opened her eyes for the first time since she had started playing. She could feel the energy in the room shift. The air had gone still. every diner hanging on to the last note of her performance. She finished with a flourish, letting the final chord resonate through the room before slowly lifting her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment Emily wondered if she had been wrong. Had she made a mistake? But then the applause came. It was slow at first, a few claps here and there, but soon it grew, building to a thunderous roar. The room erupted in cheers, some patrons standing, others clapping enthusiastically from their tables. Emily's heart swelled, and a tear threatened to escape her eye. It wasn't just the applause. It wasn't just the recognition. It was the feeling that she had finally been seen, not as a waitress, not as someone who was just anything, but as a person worthy of respect and admiration. Even Sebastian, who had been so confident in his judgment, now clapped, though it was a hollow, reluctant gesture. His smirk was gone, replaced with something closer to shock. Emily didn't care about his applause. She didn't care if he felt uncomfortable. She had reclaimed her dignity, and that was more than enough. As the applause began to die down, Emily sat frozen for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys, the final notes of her performance reverberating in the air. The room was quiet now, but in that stillness, she could feel the shift. Something had changed. The energy in the restaurant had transformed completely, and not just because of the music she had played. It was as if everyone in the room had collectively taken a deep breath, all of them now seeing her in a new light. They weren't just looking at her as the waitress who served them dinner. They were looking at her as an artist, a woman with talent, passion, and something much more than what they had originally perceived. As she slowly stood from the piano, she felt a sense of liberation wash over her. It wasn't just about proving Sebastian wrong. It wasn't about his arrogant remarks or the mockery he had thrown her way. It was about her reclaiming her voice, her identity, and the courage to stand up for what she had always believed in, even if she had kept it hidden for so long. The truth was, Emily had always known she was more than just a waitress. Deep down, she had always known that the music was her true calling, the thing that set her apart from everyone else in the room. But for years, she had pushed those dreams aside, buried them under the weight of practicality and responsibility. She had chosen to follow a path that paid the bills and helped her family, never daring to hope for more. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had stepped into her power, and it felt like a door had finally opened in her heart. The applause grew louder, with some diners standing to cheer her on, their faces beaming with admiration. Emily's coworkers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in as well, their expressions filled with pride. They knew who she was. They knew she had always been special. But to see her shine in front of everyone like that was something else entirely. Even Sebastian, who had initially sought to belittle her, seemed to be struck by the magnitude of what had just happened. His claps were slow, hesitant, and filled with discomfort. Emily didn't look at him right away. She didn't need his approval. What she needed was to embrace the moment for herself, to feel the weight of the applause and the validation that came with it. She had done something that few people ever get the chance to do. She had taken a moment of humiliation and turned it into something powerful, something beautiful. As she walked back to her station, Emily noticed how different the atmosphere had become. The tension that had once been in the air was gone, replaced by something warmer, more genuine. Patrons who had been distant before now caught her eye and offered her quiet words of praise. One older woman stopped her to say, "That was incredible. I've never heard anything so moving." Emily smiled softly and thanked her, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude. It wasn't just the compliments that meant the most to her. It was the recognition of her talent, the acknowledgement that she wasn't just a waitress with a dream, but a woman who had the strength to fight for that dream even when the odds were stacked against her. She had faced down ridicule, and she had come out on top, not because she had something to prove to anyone, but because she had finally chosen to believe in herself. As the evening wore on, Emily's steps were lighter, her posture straighter. It was as if the weight she had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. She still had a job to do, still had plates to clear and drinks to serve, but now there was a newfound sense of purpose in every movement. She no longer felt like she was just going through the motions. Every step she took now carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true self, someone who knew that she was capable of achieving something greater than she had ever imagined. When she returned to Sebastian's table to deliver the check, the smugness that had once defined him was now gone. He sat there, hands clasped in front of him, his expression one of forced neutrality. He didn't know how to react, how to handle the fact that the woman he had tried to humiliate had not only stood her ground, but had done so with grace and undeniable talent. He cleared his throat awkwardly, then said, "Well, that was unexpected." his voice lacking the usual arrogance. Emily simply nodded, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Talent comes from unexpected places." She wasn't trying to rub it in, wasn't trying to get the last word. She simply wanted to remind him that no one could define her worth except herself. As she walked away, she could feel the eyes of the room following her. But this time the energy was different. There was no longer any judgment, only respect. The once dominant presence of Sebastian Monroe had been reduced to an uncomfortable silence, his bravado shattered by a woman with nothing but her talent and the courage to be herself. And as the night continued, Emily felt something stir inside her, a quiet certainty that she was on the right path. She wasn't just a waitress with a dream anymore. She was an artist with a purpose, and nothing would ever take that away from her again. The applause seemed to hang in the air long after Emily had finished playing, reverberating in her ears like a beautiful melody she couldn't quite escape. But as the noise faded and the reality of the moment began to sink in, something inside her shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, she truly felt alive, like she had just broken free from a cage she hadn't even known existed. The music had been more than just a performance. It had been an act of defiance, a testament to her resilience and a reclaiming of her own voice. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to soak in the admiration of the room. The faces that had once looked at her with indifference now gazed at her with newfound respect. Even Sebastian, who had set out to humiliate her, was forced to acknowledge her brilliance, though his hesitant applause told a different story. It was as though the power he had once wielded over her had evaporated, replaced by the undeniable force of her talent. The room was now charged with a different energy, one of warmth and recognition. But even as she basked in the applause, Emily knew this wasn't about the validation of others. It was about the validation of herself, the acknowledgement that she had always known who she was, but had hidden it away for far too long. She had allowed herself to be defined by her circumstances, by the limitations that others had placed on her. But that night, all of that had changed. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just someone who had been trying to survive. She was an artist, someone with the power to move others to create something beautiful from the deepest parts of her soul. As she walked back to her station, Emily felt lighter, wearier than she had ever felt before. The burden that had weighed on her shoulders for so long seemed to have lifted, and each step she took was filled with a new sense of purpose. She no longer felt like she was merely going through the motions of her daily life. The act of serving dinner had been transformed into something meaningful. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was actively shaping her own destiny. The small moments that once felt mundane now held a deeper significance. Every dish she served, every glass of wine she poured, felt like a step towards something bigger, something more aligned with the woman she was becoming. The respect she had earned from her colleagues was equally as meaningful as the applause of the patrons. They had seen her struggles, witnessed her quiet determination, and now they saw the woman she had become. Emily wasn't just the waitress who played the piano during breaks. She was the woman who had dared to stand up for herself, to claim her space in a world that often overlooked people like her. That realization filled her with pride and a deep sense of gratitude. She had made it through the tough times, and now she was ready to make her mark on the world. As she continued her shift, the events of the evening seemed to unfold in slow motion. She could feel the weight of her performance settling into her bones, the confidence it had instilled in her seeping into every corner of her life. The next few hours passed in a blur, but Emily wasn't focused on the time anymore. She was focused on something greater, the future that lay ahead. When she finally returned to Sebastian's table to drop off the check, his demeanor had changed. The once sharp and arrogant man was now visibly uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by a forced air of politeness. He avoided her gaze, his eyes flicking nervously between the check and his companion's. Emily didn't care about his discomfort. She didn't need an apology or his approval. What mattered to her was that for the first time in years, she was no longer hiding. She had stood up for herself, for her dreams, and for the person she was meant to be. As she placed the check on the table, she could feel the shift in the room again. Sebastian's group had quieted, their earlier laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. Emily didn't engage with them further. She had nothing to prove anymore. Her performance had already spoken volumes. As she walked away from the table, she could feel the change within herself. She was no longer a woman on the sidelines of her own life, unsure of her worth. She was someone who had embraced her talent and let it shine, someone who had defied expectations, and in doing so had rewritten her own story. The night wasn't over yet. But as she moved through the restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had shifted. And it wasn't just the applause. It was the realization that she had finally begun to believe in herself truly and deeply. And no matter what happened next, nothing could take that away from her. As the night drew to a close, Emily locked up and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets of Charleston felt different now. They felt like they were waiting for her to take her next step. The music in her heart wasn't just a fleeting dream anymore. It was her truth, her purpose. And as she walked home that night, she knew that no matter where her journey took her, she had already found the strength to walk it with her head held high. As the night continued, the atmosphere in the Grand Oaks had dramatically shifted. The clinking of glasses, once accompanied by whispers of disdain toward Emily, had now been replaced with murmurs of admiration and respect. Patrons who had previously ignored her or looked past her as just another waitress now caught her eye with a nod or a smile. Her colleagues who had witnessed the entire ordeal were no longer watching from the sidelines with awkward glances. Instead, they walked up to her with subtle gestures of support, offering her quiet words of encouragement. But amidst all the attention, one person's reaction stood out to Emily more than the rest. Sebastian Monroe, the very man who had orchestrated her humiliation just hours before, was now visibly uncomfortable. His usual confidence had evaporated, and in its place was an awkward, almost hesitant silence. He sat at his table, hands clasped in front of him, staring into his drink, as if trying to avoid facing the very reality that had just been thrust upon him. Emily couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked now. The man who had prided himself on making others feel small and insignificant was now the one feeling small. His usual bravado had been shattered, and despite his best efforts to regain control, it was clear he didn't know how to react to the situation anymore. As Emily made her way around the restaurant, doing her job as usual, the once intimidating presence of Sebastian and his entourage felt almost diminished. His group, who had once laughed at her expense, now sat in silence, avoiding eye contact with her, their earlier arrogance completely gone. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. Where once it had been about his money and influence, it was now about her talent, her resilience, and the undeniable strength she had shown in the face of his mockery. It was an incredible feeling. Emily had always known she was capable of more, but in that moment she realized just how powerful it could be to stand up for herself, to not let anyone dictate who she was or what she could achieve. Even though she had been nervous at first, afraid of what would happen, when she stepped up to the piano, she now knew that her choice to play wasn't just about proving a point to Sebastian. It was about reclaiming her life, her passions, and her worth. As the evening went on, the restaurant's atmosphere continued to change. No longer were the guests at the Grand Oaks fixated on the spectacle of Sebastian's wealth and dominance. Instead, they were focused on the quiet dignity of Emily the waitress, who had silently endured and then risen above. And as she continued to serve her tables, she could feel the eyes of the room following her. But this time there was no judgment, only a quiet respect. Sebastian's table, however, remained tense. His once carefree demeanor had been replaced by a kind of forced politeness. He attempted to speak to Emily when she came to deliver the check, but there was no longer that biting edge in his voice. His words were calculated, trying to appear nonchalant, but his discomfort was palpable. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, his tone lacking the usual sharpness. Emily smiled, but it wasn't a smile meant to please him. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction, of someone who had finally found the courage to be herself, to stand her ground against someone who had tried to diminish her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "Talent comes from unexpected places." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment the room fell silent. Sebastian, as if sensing the weight of the situation, shifted in his seat awkwardly, clapping his hands together in a slow, reluctant applause. His companions, who had laughed along with him earlier, now looked unsure of what to do. It was as though the reality of the moment had struck them all. They had witnessed something far more important than they had anticipated. Sebastian, for all his wealth and bravado, had been outdone by a woman who had nothing but her passion and her authenticity. Emily, on the other hand, knew she didn't need his acknowledgement. The applause she had received from the diners, from her colleagues, and from herself was all the validation she needed. It wasn't about Sebastian's begrudging acknowledgement or the superficial applause of a man who had tried to humiliate her. It was about the quiet confidence she had gained in herself and that she realized was worth more than any praise she could receive. As she walked away from the table, she noticed the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed for good. The earlier tension had dissolved, and now people seemed more at ease. They weren't just dining in a lavish restaurant, they were witnessing a woman reclaim her power. And that was something far more profound than any fine dining experience could offer. Emily didn't look back at Sebastian or his group. She didn't need to. She had already proven her worth, not through words or confrontation, but through the purity of her talent and the strength of her spirit. And as the night drew to a close, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because of the applause, but because she had shown herself and everyone around her exactly who she was. She wasn't just a waitress. She was an artist, and that was more than enough. As the night wore on, Emily felt a shift within herself, a quiet confidence, blossoming that she hadn't felt in years. The moment at the piano, the one that had seemed so intimidating at first, had become a defining one. The applause had long faded, but its impact remained etched in her heart. It wasn't just the recognition from the guests or the validation she had so desperately craved. It was the powerful realization that she had found her voice, and no one could ever take that away from her. The restaurant, once filled with the subtle tension of Sebastian's dominance, now had a different energy. The chatter around the room was lighter, more genuine. The patrons who had previously been consumed by their own thoughts and the luxury of the surroundings now seemed to appreciate the authenticity in the air. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about the story unfolding in front of them. Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman who had faced adversity, had been mocked, and yet had risen to the occasion with nothing but her talent and her heart. And as she moved between the tables collecting empty glasses and plates, she realized that the respect she had earned from the room wasn't just a result of her performance. It was the culmination of everything she had silently endured and fought for in her life. The respect was more profound than any applause. It was the understanding that in that one moment, Emily had shown who she really was. She had let her passion speak louder than the cynicism and the judgments of others. Even Sebastian, though his initial response had been one of discomfort and begrudging acknowledgement, seemed to be processing what had just happened. As Emily passed by his table later, his face was not the smug, arrogant one it had been earlier. Instead, it was almost unreadable, a mask of confusion, disappointment, and something else. A dawning realization that he had underestimated her, that his own assumptions about power and success had been entirely off. Emily didn't need his approval. She didn't need to hear him say the words, "I was wrong," or "You proved me wrong." She knew that she had already proven her worth in the only way that mattered, by being true to herself. Her eyes didn't linger on him. She didn't feel the need to engage with him anymore. The moment she had been waiting for wasn't about his recognition. It was about her own self-acknowledgement. She had faced his mockery and the sneers of others and turned it into something beautiful. As the evening continued, she noticed that the tension in the air had shifted from awkwardness to warmth. Her colleagues, who had been watching from a distance, now approached her with smiles that were filled with pride. They weren't just impressed by her talent. They were proud of her strength. They had witnessed her transformation from a woman who had silently endured her circumstances to one who had boldly claimed her place in the world. Emily's coworkers had seen her at her most vulnerable, and now they saw her at her most powerful. They too had been touched by the authenticity of her performance, the courage it took for her to stand up for herself. Their support meant more to her than she could express. As the restaurant began to wind down, the tables slowly emptied and the lights in the dining room dimmed. Emily felt a quiet sense of fulfillment wash over her. This night had not been about showing off for an audience or proving a point to Sebastian. It had been about reclaiming a part of herself that had been buried under the weight of practicality for far too long. She had chosen to step into her power, and in doing so, she had discovered something profound about herself, something she had always known, but had never allowed herself to fully embrace. She was more than the circumstances she had grown up in. She was more than the job she did to make ends meet. She was an artist, and no one could diminish that. As Emily locked up the restaurant at the end of the night and stepped out into the cool evening air, she felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. The city around her was still quiet, but it felt different. It felt like the world was opening up to her in a way it never had before. The dreams that had once seemed too far out of reach now felt closer, more tangible. It wasn't that she thought she would become a famous pianist overnight, but the doors she had once feared to open now felt ready for her to step through. Emily had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt certain of one thing. She was finally on the right path. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living in a way that aligned with her passions and her truth. That night, she realized that her dreams were not just something to be chased, They were something she could make a reality one step at a time, and nothing would ever stop her from taking that journey. The days following that pivotal night at the Grand Oaks felt like they were infused with new energy for Emily. It wasn't just the recognition she had received from the restaurant's patrons, or even the quiet pride of her coworkers that lingered in her heart. It was something deeper, a quiet sense of purpose that began to shape her every decision and action. For so long, Emily had walked through life with a sense of uncertainty, constantly battling between the practicality of her day job and the dreams she had long buried beneath the weight of responsibility. But now, with the applause of that night still echoing in her mind, she felt a shift in herself. The seed of self-belief had been planted, and it began to grow, nourishing her spirit in a way she had never allowed herself before. As she walked into the Grand Oaks each evening, the piano in the corner no longer felt like a distant reminder of her forgotten dreams. It felt like a silent partner, patiently waiting for her to return. She no longer viewed the piano as something that had to remain untouched because there wasn't enough time, or because she was afraid of what others might think. The restaurant had always been more than just a place to work. Now it had become a space where Emily could reconnect with who she was meant to be. She made it a point to steal moments during her shifts to sit at the piano to play quietly when the restaurant was calm. Those short but precious moments weren't just a way to pass time. They were an affirmation. They reminded her of the artist she had always been and would always be. It wasn't long before Emily's colleagues began to notice the change in her. Her presence in the restaurant became one of quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the woman who had walked through the door months earlier, unsure of her worth. They saw her take charge in ways they hadn't witnessed before, whether it was in handling difficult customers with poise or in how she carried herself when she interacted with the management team. Emily wasn't just doing her job anymore, she was thriving in it. But the real transformation took place when Emily received an unexpected phone call a few days after her performance. A man who had been dining at the Grand Oaks that evening, a music producer visiting from Nashville, had reached out to her. He had been in the audience when she played, and he had been moved by what he had heard. He wasn't offering her fame or fortune. Instead, he offered her the chance to record a demo. It wasn't a huge opportunity, but it was a chance, a real tangible step toward the life Emily had always wanted. She hadn't expected such an offer, and at first the old doubts crept in. Was she really ready for this? Was she good enough? But those thoughts didn't last long. Emily had spent far too long doubting herself, letting fear dictate her actions. This time she didn't let it win. She said yes. As the days passed, Emily threw herself into her music with a new sense of determination. She found herself practicing longer than she had in years, writing songs, refining her technique, and recording the demo that would be the first step toward a future she had longed for. There were challenges along the way. Of course, balancing her work at the Grand Oaks with her newfound commitment to her music wasn't easy, but she was no longer afraid of hard work. She had learned through everything that had happened that no dream was too big if she was willing to put in the effort. And for the first time, she wasn't just working to survive, she was working to build something that was hers, something that had meaning beyond paying bills. With each passing day, her passion for music grew stronger. She realized that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of inspiration, it was a calling. The piano was no longer just an object in a restaurant corner. It was her partner, the one thing that had always been there for her, waiting patiently for her to return. As Emily continued to work at the Grand Oaks and record her music in her free time, she began to see the results of her efforts. The demo led to more opportunities, small but significant ones. And soon she was playing at local venues and getting her music heard by a wider audience. The validation she had once sought from others now came from within. She didn't need the approval of Sebastian Monroe or anyone else to define her worth. She had found her voice, and that was enough. As she stood on stage at her first solo performance, looking out at the audience who had come to hear her music, Emily knew one thing for sure: she was no longer just a waitress. She was an artist, and her journey had only just begun. Every step, every note, and every challenge was leading her to the future she had always dreamed of, and this time nothing would stand in her way.